It was called Unit 731. Its work would later be compared to the horrors of Nazi Germany. It conducted experiments that are still considered too extreme even today. And its existence was covered up for decades by the government of one of our closest allies, Japan. This is the dark, secret history of one of the most evil organizations that you have probably never heard about. This is the history of Unit 731. Before we get into this video, let me just say that this is quite possibly one of the darkest periods in human history. What you are about to hear is very disturbing, and it might even make you sick to your stomach. So if you think you can't handle it, please click away now. But if you want to know the dark truth about what happened during World War II, then stay tuned, because this is going to be one hell of a ride. All right, let's go back to September 2nd, 1945. After 6 years of total war, Japan had surrendered and World War II was over. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. You see, there was more going on behind the scenes than anyone knew at the time. In fact, the Japanese had been running a top-secret research program throughout the entire war, and they had developed some truly horrifying things. The only problem was, no one was supposed to ever find out about it. That's because their experiments were so cruel that if the world knew what they had been doing, the Japanese would have been utterly destroyed after the war. In order to understand why, we need to first take a look at what Unit 731 actually was. Unit 731 was the name given to a series of secret Japanese, wartime biological and chemical research facilities that operated across the East Asia region during the Second World War. Established in 1932, its purpose was to conduct medical experiments on humans with the aim of creating new biological weapons and combat therapies for use against the Japanese military. Sounds like a good idea. Well, the reality couldn't have been further from it. You see, the Japanese didn't exactly do things by the book. Instead of testing their new medicines and weapons on lab rats, they decided to use real people. The only problem was those people weren't volunteers. They were prisoners taken from occupied territories who had absolutely no idea what they were getting themselves into. Unit 731 was run by the Kwantung Army of the Imperial Japanese Army, and the main facility was located in the region of Manchuria, which is now northeast China. Situated in the small town of Pingfang, it was surrounded by barracks where soldiers lived and worked, and was camouflaged by trees so it couldn't be seen by Allied forces. The nearby POW camp provided Unit 731 with a seemingly endless supply of human test subjects. But before we go any further, I should point out that the Japanese army didn't limit themselves to just one facility. There were several others scattered across the region, such as the infamous Harbin 731 research facility in the city of Harbin, which ran between 1936 and 1945. Each of these laboratories specialized in different areas of research, such as developing new biological weapons and plague factories. They mass-produced anthrax and plague bacteria. There was even a department dedicated to vivisection, which means they cut open living bodies to observe the effects of diseases. As you can probably imagine, running a department like that required a lot of test subjects, and the Japanese army had more than enough of them to go around. See, the Japanese army was no stranger to horrible, inhumane acts, and they had been committing terrible atrocities against the Chinese population since the 1930s, when they invaded the country. By the time the laboratories were at their peak, they had already murdered millions of Chinese civilians, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers that they had captured and taken prisoner. So what did they do with all of these prisoners? Well, many of them were sent to work camps, where they were forced to do hard labor until they died. Others were used as human shields whenever the Japanese army but a huge percentage of prisoners were also sent to the laboratories of Unit 731, where they were tortured and experimented on until they died. Some of the prisoners were lucky if they only had to endure 1 or 2 tests before being released, but many others were killed in the process. We don't know the exact number of people who were murdered by Unit 731, because the records were destroyed before the end of the war. However, estimates put the number somewhere between 3,500 and 10,000 victims, which is a pretty terrifying thought. But that's not even the worst part. That's because many of the experiments carried out by the Japanese scientists were beyond inhumane, and would make the most sadistic of men break down and cry like a baby. For example, the scientists wanted to learn more about frostbite, so they exposed prisoners to sub-zero temperatures until their skin froze. Then they would warm them up slowly to study the effects. Other prisoners were sewn up in airtight metal boxes and left to die of asphyxiation. Some were infected with horrible diseases, like plague and cholera, so the doctors could study the effects. And others were even infected with multiple diseases at once, to see what would happen. They also did horrible things to women, like forcibly infecting them with sexually transmitted diseases. And they even experimented on babies by cutting open their skulls and removing parts of their brains to see what would happen. What's even more crazy is that these were just some of the less extreme experiments carried out by the Japanese. There was even one scientist at Unit 731 named Shira, who became obsessed with sexually transmitted diseases and wanted to find a way to create an STD that could be used as a biological weapon. As you can imagine, things like this didn't happen just once or twice. We're talking about hundreds of experiments and hundreds of murders. So now you're probably asking yourself why the world didn't destroy Japan after the war when they found out what they had been doing. Well, the answer is quite simple. See, after the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the victorious Allies divided the country into 4 separate zones of occupation, with each power taking control of a different section. This included the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. As you can imagine, the Soviets were the ones who ended up discovering the facilities of Unit 731, along with the horrible things that had been done there. However, instead of telling the other Allies what they had found, the Soviets decided to cover it up. That's because they had struck a deal with the Japanese. As part of the agreement, the Soviet Union agreed to keep quiet about Unit 731 in exchange for all of the research data collected by the Japanese scientists. They also took all of the Japanese staff and scientists with them back to the USSR and forced them to help develop new biological weapons for the Red Army. To this day, we don't know what sort of things the Soviets and Japanese were cooking up together in their secret labs, but it certainly wasn't anything good. However, as the Cold War progressed and the Soviet Union became more open about its past, more and more documents were and one of those documents was a detailed report about the atrocities committed by Unit 731. It was published in 1992 and shocked the world. Since then, more survivor testimonies have come to light, and a number of books have been written about the atrocities committed by Unit 731. Yet despite all of this, many people still don't know about what happened in those laboratories. Even today, there are still people alive who were experimented on by Unit 731. One of them is a man named Yoshimasa Ishii, who was only 9 years old when he was taken from his home one day and taken to a laboratory where he was held for 3 years. During that time, he witnessed some truly horrific things. He watched as scientists sliced open his friends and relatives and studied their organs and remains. He even survived several experiments himself, including being infected with syphilis. When asked why the world should remember what happened at Unit 731, Ishikawa said that it was so we can pray for the dead and hope that something like this will never happen again. Of course, while it's important that we never forget what happened during World War II, especially considering that there are still people alive who were affected by it, it's also true that Japan has changed a lot since then. The country is now one of our closest allies, and many of us have Japanese friends who we love and cherish. That's why it's important to remember that although Japan did commit some horrible things during the war, the country as a whole does not deserve to be punished for what their ancestors did. Unfortunately, though, there are still a few people in the country who try to downplay or deny the atrocities committed by Unit 731. For example, one of the former members of Unit 731, named Toshio, once gave a lecture at a university in Taiwan in which he claimed that most of the experiments were carried out with the consent of the prisoners and that the staff of Unit 731 were all heroes of Japan. Comments like this are not only offensive to the memory of the victims, but they also contribute to the idea that Japan should be allowed to forget its past. And that's why it's so important that we keep telling stories like this one, so that future generations will always know the truth. So what do you think? Do you think the world was right to forget about Unit 7? Or should Japan be made to face up to their dark past once and for all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.